there's a lot of them.
Get the lightning on him.
Yeah, I'm all dead.
Oh, yeah.
Do it, lightning.
Oh, my God.
I can only hold it for so long. I can't hold it.
Wow. Okay, that was really quite awesome. I got myself, for that mission, a heavy grade grey grit shirt. Lovely.
Yeah, I got some burlap pants.
Well worth it. DARKTIDE released at the end of November 22, and it's almost difficult to believe a year has already passed. The game has just released its biggest update so far, which focuses on the specific refinement of the way your characters play within their class. It also has finally released on Xbox and Xbox Game Pass. Each of the 4 classes has seen its progression of skill unlocks replaced with a talent tree featuring 3 main pathways and a total of 24 abilities, 12 passive talents and up to 30 talent points to spend. What does all that mean? We'll get into it shortly. This update comes after a year of continual adjustments and development for the game, which resulted in them looking now at changing the core of what defines a player character, which enables further implications on many parts of the game. DARKTIDE had a very enthusiastic, albeit very rocky release, which continued steadily from there on. One of the core criticisms being, of course, it did not focus strongly enough on the narrative or the lore side of things. And I think personally the answer here is that the devs likely wanted to do a lot more with the narrative and as yet have been unable to do so. This is my personal impression of things, and whilst they had Dan Abnett to create a backstory and world build around the city and the planet, people have been very vocal about how this did not translate or it didn't live to their expectations. It's one of the things that I've seen most requested, but it may surprise you that there are a great many who do not care about this in any shape or form, because DARKTIDE is not an RPG game, it's a Tide game, which means investing something of yourself through your own character and playstyle, but that are primarily there for the brutal, grinding slaughter gameplay. It's also been noted that more so than in previous Tide games, DARKTIDE was less prescriptive in the way it presents who you play as. The thinking, as I understood it, was that in place of your character having a heavy lore package and a specific you're choosing to play as this guy, they focused more toward a forge your own narrative direction. The problem with this is that in order for that to work, it still requires some aspects of in-game narrative to support it. It's simply not enough to just leave it to the player's imagination, and I think that's been ultimately also a big sticking point for anybody beyond players who are just in it for the Tide grind at the max levels. What is interesting though is that DARKTIDE remains extremely enjoyable from a mechanical and visual perspective. From the times this year where I've jumped back into the game, grabbed a few friends, it's always been a blast, and the intensity of the engagements, the fact that I'm immersed in a 40k world dripping with visual lore, and just personally for myself mechanical gameplay that feels awesome. Alongside the many adjustments for balance, they have released new levels, different enemy encounters and so on. But the big question of course is it enough? When I got back into the game this week with a level Druid Super, the experience was, as always, a fun, engaging, sometimes challenging and enjoyable time. But as many of you agreed when I asked in the community section of the channel this week, while there is still much to be enjoyed, there is very much a need and scope for further development, and I'll talk about that later on. Just covering a few things that I want to see the game address, as well as to continue focusing and developing things from here, because this update raises the prospect of additional classes in the future, which to be clear is entirely my own speculation, and if it were to happen this is all well and good. But before then, I think everyone seems to agree that we absolutely need a focus from now on the narrative side of things. But first, let's look into the significant addition of these class talent trees. It shouldn't be underestimated how much of a change the talent trees bring to DARKTIDE. The main concept behind them is to open out the gameplay much more for each class, where for example the sharpshooter is now just one of the builds available within the veteran tree. It benefits from grenades with different functionality like crack and smoke. The psyker class can play from a perspective of handling individual targets, crowd control, or even defensively for your squad by raising a shield to block incoming enemy fire. The Ogryn can even properly tank now, as well as the option of its standard grenades or just big chunks of rock which replenish over time. You'll earn 1 talent point per level, and players can respec at any time, which thankfully does not mean having to wipe your entire tree and start again. You can go back 1 node at a time. According to Fatshock, one core principle they want to follow was being able to reach an end node at around the 20 point mark, and then you have obviously 10 points left to play with. The inclusion of stat nodes within the tree also enables what was previously a hard-coded baseline into a player's control. You can begin with your starting values for health, crit chance, toughness, etc., and this is then boosted through selecting stat nodes within the talent tree as you feel is necessary. While there are many passive ability selections, each class is notably different in the weight it places towards certain nodes based on their layout and adjacent modifiers. Most trees will open with a range of passive abilities, some more than others, and I found it was often best to pick a key route and then return here to the top later if you had additional points to spend. The first key abilities are the Blitz. These are your grenades, save for the Veteran, or other key attacks like Smite or Brain Burst for the Psyker. Next you'll usually have an Aura, some kind of AoE function for the group, and then lower a combat function before you progress down to the Keystone abilities. There are nodes and passive abilities connecting each of these sections. The combat abilities are the powerful actions that have a significant influence on your game, with the keystone further down then being more of a finalization that drives your playstyle rather than specific ultimate abilities, as it were. With the Oghren as an example, its combat ability would either be the charge that we're familiar with, ploughing through the enemy, or as a protector, taunting the enemies, making them attack only you for a period of time, 15 seconds. Or if you're opting for a more weapon-based build, Point Blank Barrage swaps to and reloads your ranged weapon. You have a 25% plus rate of fire and 70% plus reload speed for the next 10 seconds, with a cooldown of 80 seconds. And this is how really those combat functions work. It doesn't mean the way you play the game has to change either from as it stands now. If you already have refined and enjoyed a specific style for a class character, it can still remain so. You could just choose a more conservative, mixed build, and for those of you who want to be more extreme in their focus, you can go down one line of the talent tree to forge a role that is specific and powerful in its own lane. From a technical perspective, building 4 class talent trees, each with a huge variety of potential combinations and choices, is not a small thing, and it's no wonder it took the devs so long. Not to mention more than a little difficult from a balancing perspective. Because while you have those single linear builds which lean in on a singular focus and may be better for players who just want to pick talent choices in a few minutes and get straight into a game, you're also going to have those who want to explore the meta side of things, carefully tweaking and refining a class to discover its most powerful build for their specific playstyle. When I was exploring a few tree builds, it really adds considerable flexibility to a class, and it's not as restrictive as other games I've played in the past who had very tight talent trees, where once you are more than a third of the way through a tree, you're pretty much committed to your specific end goal. The Darktide trees are not at all like this, and the scope for customization at all levels is considerable. As you can see in the Psyker tree, there are many passive abilities and different routes in the beginning. Then we come to the Blitz abilities like the Brain Rupture. These have various modifiers which are adjacent to them. Smite being one of those new abilities with chain lightning, enfeebling and generally freezing an enemy in place. The Assail ability allows you to throw these ethereal shards at your enemy, and I'll demonstrate that here shortly. Then you have various auras, passive abilities, nodes as you progress down through. Then we come to the more combat abilities which demonstrate specific abilities like that shielding and so forth, ways that will affect yourself and the party, and some of these can be more defensive or offensive. Then you're generally going to move into some more passive abilities before getting down to the lower keystone abilities, and the keystone abilities generally, like we say, are dictating a more of a play style than specifically some end ability which is going to be extremely powerful. It's more just to kind of finalize and frame the way that you're choosing to play. Interestingly as well, throughout the talent trees, whilst you can select whatever you want to going down through the tree, as for example with the Blitz section, once you unlock one of those core abilities, it locks out the others, so that obviously whilst you can still have some customization going down through the nodes and the passive abilities, those more powerful abilities are locked out, so it does still control to a degree your selections as you go down through the tree. But as you can see, there is the ability as you go down through the tree, even right down to the keystone elements at the end, if you wanted to mix those elements in, it's not completely strictly linear, which like I say, I have seen in other games. Undoubtedly, this change will have a significant impact on the game and its balance. And to accommodate this, the devs say they have shifted baseline difficulty scales, even retuned health pools for enemies, adjusted spawning limits, and rebalanced core parts of the damage system. It even goes as deep as overhauling stacked damage multipliers. Now, throughout the past year, the game has already seen a significant amount of balances and refinements of weapons. Undoubtedly and inevitably, I would imagine that in the months post this update, there will be further refinements. I hope though that this doesn't become the majority focus, or require some kind of major adjustment. Because with this update being now a year in, I'm sure players want to continue moving forward with the game beyond just base stats and technical details. I didn't have the time to fully explore every single talent and the rewards for each class, but hopefully this does give an idea of some of the things on offer. There's certainly a lot to experiment with in each class and a lot of variables. At a more basic level though, it just adds a lot to the game in terms of how each class can play and should breathe some life into the game. But as we will discuss next, this in and of itself is certainly not the end point for where things need to be. When DARKTIDE released, there was the expectation from many that a few months post-release we would be seeing a content update that pushed the narrative forward. This was certainly my expectation. Where we, as Imperial prisoners thrown down into exploring firsthand the nightmares facing humanity in M41, ourselves nameless individuals clinging on in the meat grinder of Imperial lore, given a final hope to redeem ourselves. The issue was, people, including as I say myself, took this very literally. There was very certainly an expectation of significant character exposition as you leveled through the game. Technically, this does happen in a way. It's just not very specific, and as you progress through the cutscenes which show you rising through the ranks until ultimately you become a fully fledged member of the Inquisition team being deployed here to the world, quite obviously this happens very visually through the game as you unlock your aesthetics, your improved weaponry and your abilities. In the game itself, we peel back the adamantium skin of a hive city and experience a measure of what it means to exist as a member of humanity amid a galactic civilization decaying in real time, where the Imperium continues to dictate the fundamental parameters of human lives throughout the galaxy, no different here than anywhere else, with its feeble mortal flesh currency of humans only ever knowing as much as they are told, as much as they need to. Where DARKTIDE succeeded is in its visually rich environments that were some of the best ever seen for a 40k game. It also provided mechanically rewarding addictive gameplay that was hard to put down, and I still feel that. This cannot though unfortunately exist in isolation, because 40k is a world of narrative and lore. There needs to be exposition, because without it anything over time becomes steadily less engaging. As we've seen this year, DARKTIDE has spent considerable time refining details of the game, nerfs, buffs, details of weaponry, and of course implementing things that were meant to be in place at release, such as the refinement of blessings, weapon perks and so forth, the ability to buy base grey weapons and then progress them up. Even the implementation of this has unfortunately been contentious though, because whilst you have players who want to just jump into a 40k world and smash through hordes regardless of a win or a lose, there are also those who want to refine down the absolute meta of efficiency. Most often this means wanting to be able to refine weapons down to a personal spec, without it costing mountains of in-game grind resources to do so. And all around, people just don't seem to enjoy a weapon system whereby they're initially spec'd heavily on RNG. Now, to be quite honest with you, none of this greatly matters to somebody like me, because I really couldn't care less about the differences between many of the weapons with their blessings and their modifiers, beyond how they very obviously feel at a superficial level, and that's just the honest truth. And any of you who are real veterans here of the channel will remember that I used to regularly speak to this fact that the endless dissection of weapon strengths and weaknesses in FPS in general was something that I always pushed back on, although admittedly this was very often in a human multiplayer environment, not against increasing waves of AI enemy, where it's fair enough that at the end game weapon meta definitely has far bigger implications. For somebody like me though, who is very much all about the narrative, the stories, I'm just not into something like DARKTIDE for the meta grind. I enjoy it for the feel, the visual environment, the gameplay, the immersion. Plus, what I as a player believe this game needs most of all is a huge injection of narrative. But even something like the weapon system could be adapted to fit within the narrative and lore, and very easily. But it would surely make sense that we also need to at this point increase the level cap for the classes to go beyond 30, say up to 50 for now. What could be done, for example, would be to enable a more steady unlocking of the abilities to more specifically customize your weapon, because it makes complete sense that some penal colony rejects are stuck using whatever trash weapons they can get their hands on, but it makes far less sense that a member of an Inquisition warband is having to bleed gold from their eyes just to have a weapon re-blessed. Now, DARKTIDE is a game at the end of the day, and it is not a walking simulator. So very similarly to how 40k tabletop game does not perfectly align with the lore, neither does this. Because I'm not saying you need to make it necessarily free to upgrade weapons and so forth, you need to have that progression and grind. But surely when you're purchasing grey weapons once you reach level 30, you no longer really should have to be relying on randomization, especially for that initial weapon modifier. It would be easy to enable players at 30 to just select this, and this even, as I said, makes sense within the narrative framing of things. So just a small idea also adjacent to this, there also needs to be a specific mission pack which moves the narrative forward. So imagine we move from level 30 to 40. There should be 3-4 new levels with an environment that tells an unfolding story through both the environment, new enemies, cutscenes after the first successful completion of those missions, and a final progressing scene once all are completed. I would then like to see you unlock, say, 1 or 2 more missions with similar narrative explorations at 50. This has to be a fundamental focus for the game from here, in my personal opinion, because without that, I think it's really going to be wasting now what was an amazing opportunity with a 40k game. Another area that we should look at as well is quick play. And quick play, whilst not an immediate thought, is important. Because many people of course want to squad up with friends, as I have done this week, but many people's lives are very busy, and this is just not always practical. So it's pretty well understood that whilst many games will always have that hardcore player base that are just in it for the long run, many games live and die by the, let's just say it, more casual player. Now casual doesn't mean unskilled, it doesn't mean invalid or anything of the sort, but it does mean somebody who maybe just wants to jump on, play a few runs and jump out. And quite honestly, I would put myself in that category. Because after any game releases, the drop-off in these players usually represents the bulk of the player base. Because the die-hard grinding players are the ones that are there to remain. And I've seen and talked about this endlessly with past games I've covered back when this channel was all about the games. So improving the quick play, why? Well, most of all to be more consistent. Because this remains something of a critical but unseen aspect. And what do I mean by this? Well, mostly it's about the differences between a low intensity and a high intensity run. When you're playing with a group of players who understand you, understand everybody's strengths, weaknesses, and are communicating, a lot of those huge differences in the intensity of the gameplay runs, it's far more tolerable, adaptable, it's something that you have to make work, and that's kind of how it should be. But the gap between these things is significant, and what this means is that when you jump in on a quick play, the adaptability of a player and their skills is very paramount, which translates to, most of the time, a very inconsistent experience, where more often than not, you're likely not going to have the best time, most especially if you're joining into a run which was already in progress. Now let me be clear, the scaling modifiers for Darktide are both good and necessary, because they keep that gameplay variable and interesting. But it is a double-edged sword, especially when it comes to quick play, because what creates a much needed challenge and enjoyable moments for a well-communicating, focused team of friends who are sitting down for an intense Darktide session becomes a frustrating pain for random quick play, because the scale to which the mission modifiers alter the difficulty are just too large to sit within that skill tolerance range of a random squad of players. And this affects everybody, because a player who maybe is comfortable in a low intensity game gets thrown into a gauntlet of high intensity, they're going to end up frustrated and overwhelmed. Very obviously, a player who enjoys a high intensity game mode and gets thrown into a low, it's going to be the opposite. Both scenarios end up with the players likely stepping away, which is obviously not what you want. How to solve this? I think firstly just enable a setting that if you quick play you don't get thrown into the lowest or the highest intensity missions, unless you specifically say wanted to opt for that. Secondly, you could select some maps that specifically give a choice of whether you want low or high intensity. And this might seem an unimportant detail, but it's really not, because even at release, one of the things I saw most often in the comments were people talking about the quick play experience, which of course was not my experience. My experience was squadding up and playing as I usually do. But this shouldn't be dismissed as something which is not important. There may likely be those of you who would say, well, it's not how the game is supposed to be played, it's just a secondary option, which is of course nonsense. Somebody jumping in for an hour is no less valid than somebody with a tight team who want to play regularly many hours week to week. For any game like Darktide to continue to have growth, both of these player sets needs to be catered to, and that's the real focus here. Because whilst Darktide had this rocky release and a year which saw very little narrative updates beyond some missions and some other elements within the game, the talent tree system now is a genuinely significant and interesting update. But it's not a shock to anybody that in 2023, some games are only getting themselves in a position they hoped to be a year down the line. It's almost the norm at this point. Is that acceptable? I think that's really a discussion for the comments. But do I want to see Darktide be one of those games which just slowly fades into obscurity? I genuinely don't. The gameplay remains extremely enjoyable and hard to put down. The 40k environments and the tone of things obviously resonate extremely strongly with somebody like me, and I want this game to have an opportunity to continue to develop. New enemies, new classes, and yes, more narrative in some shape or form. With the game having come this far, it would be a tremendous shame if it could not continue forward to become what it has the potential to be. Something which could keep rewarding players for many years. With the mechanical and the balancing aspects having been worked on so much this year, it's surely time for more advancement in other areas. I strongly hope that this is what we see. If you haven't jumped into Darktide for some time, I do encourage you to do so. I will be this week with players from my Discord community as well, and also maybe some live streams here and there. As always, please do tell me your thoughts, ideas and experiences in the comments. I hope that you will enjoy this current talent tree update. I'll probably post on the community page soon and gauge some opinions and thoughts from those of you who have been trying it out. And of course, as always, I'll see you all in the next one.
Oh, jeez.
Alright, I'm jumping down. Too many sniper shit.
There's a sniper back there, yeah. Several. Oh, that's not a good sound. That's not a good sound. Here he comes.
Or
Beastie boy.
Yeah.
You have to shoot him in his back.
Dog's behind.
Dog.
Got it.
Nice.
Make sure he doesn't eat you.
Alright, Beastie
Another
Boy's
dog.
coming my way. Hit the explodey barrel.
Dog's
That
dead.
ranged guy. Oh, there he is.
Gotta hit his yoke.
Scramble that egg.
Yeah.
Now I'm hungry.
Oh, he's
barking
hungry.
at me.
He's a hungry lad.
Who's shooting?
Oh, and a charger boy.
I'm hitting him.
Can you break
Yep,
through
down.
this?
Got him.
Yes, get its yoke.
I put a grenade. Actually, I forgot if grenades work well on.
Ah.
There we go.
Nice.
Yes.
Who's hungry?
Hard boiled.